My philosophy of teaching, my ethics, is to help the student seeking to know what is in the markings of the composer's publisher and the composer who has died that has to be played and understood, translated, interpreted. I find it very important because, of course, you can listen to recordings and imitate idols, but also you could read articles and understand musicologically the options about how to go for a sforzando in a Beethoven sonata, how to understand a marking of Ravel. How to understand a German language specific choice of words by Schumann for a marking compared to a metronome marking, which is more objective, and the text of the words, of course, is more subjective. And so I find myself inevitably between the composer and the student, centuries apart, rediscovering with me next to them the same piece or the new pieces of the repertoire that appear, and try to understand what it is that we are supposed to mean in the narration, in the logic, in the storytelling. How do we define the stylistic frame? How do we define an accent in Beethoven in a sforzando versus a tenuto, and who decides subjectively about the rubato, and how do we organize the transitions in a form which defines the thematic materials in a sonata? Or how much does the music itself translate the very storytelling of the composer using the idiom of the instrument as a transmission of their own experience of life, of the meaning of spiritual elevation, of what was that outside of their own context, and not only the instruments of the time, though it is, but also the hearing, the capacity of attention, the necessity for the repeats, the restatements, which are not just to be played or not, or to play differently, because both ways are false justifications. It has to be taken in account as part of the statement. You have to enter in the understanding of the stylistic and the aesthetic framework of a composer's expression in order to make these choices. And I am thinking that it is wonderful to discover what it means to a young person who doesn't have as much experience of having perhaps self-censored themselves through the options and the different, let's say, drawbacks that you have received through life, and you end up by choosing a certain way of understanding the things. The status quo is to be questioned. That is clear. And that is why nothing remains the same, in the sense that it means differently to different people, to different generations. And it has to be meaningful in any case, and we have to accept the alterity, not because we don't have an opinion or because for political correctness we won't be afraid to impose it. Rather, give the tools to the student to find their own framework within which they're going to develop, evolve, and eventually contradict themselves with time if they have the luck to pursue the search for not the truth but the coherence of the moment during which they perform, record, or teach or present a piece in its entirety, or specific facts of the stylistic elements. And inevitably, we build our own set of rules, either because we inherited from our teachers blindly, either because we questioned them, and perhaps we reached our own, and pretending to own a tradition and a truth would be pretentious, but students need guides. And for instance, a guideline would be a grace note is not awkwardly always equalized to the other note. And if not, the notation would have been just equal notes. So we don't have recorded evidence of how people performed it, let less the composers of the time, which triggered them to do a specific notation. Does the meter matter in the choice, in the tempo, for the pulse, for the phrase, for the essence of the motion, rather than only the speed by itself? And beyond objectivity is the subjective point of view of which technique will match which interpretational choice. How do I do the articulation? How do I do the voicing? How do I bring out the layering of the voicings? And how do I bring basically in 3D the text with my point of view as a performer, either intuitively, either prepared, either both, managing the unexpected also on stage, acoustics, instrument, emotion, and sometimes intuition. It's not a bad word because we can have time to do reflection and, as I said earlier, read articles and hear how other people have played, understood in their own way the piece which we are going to play. And I find myself in a situation where I go to the text and I try to bring out how I read it, how I decipher it, how I understand it from the hints of the notation versus the composer's intent. Now, who defines the composer's intent? I do, in absence of the composer. But then, in order to match or differ with the notation in terms of how you handle it, how you distribute it between the hands, and why did the composer not distribute it in a more practical way for a pianist to be more reliable? It's a question of gesture that corresponds to an interval, to an emotional leap, to an expression which could be also orchestral, with often in Beethoven sonatas fragmentation, where you hear strings and winds and brass and percussion. And they don't play, but in a certain sequence of events in an orchestra, not all of them play all the time, but the single performer on the piano does. So you have to differentiate the text, the context, the texture, the alterity of the piece versus what you are doing in the piece, since you are only narrating the storytelling of it by yourself. You don't give yourself an upbeat, or you should if you can count independently of your playing. But let's say you overwhelmed as a pianist by the technical expectations, and then you don't have the opportunity to be also detached as a conductor who doesn't play, and orchestra musicians who don't decide of the conducting pulse and ritenuto or accelerando. In other words, in a tandem, the forward person decides of the destination, and the back person contributes to the destination's arrival. And I find that if this analogy works between a student, then that would be very only in a certain way imposing, just because of experience or because of hopefully respect. But admiration would be too much to ask. Perhaps it's a mix of the things. After all, the student doesn't need me to tell them why to love the piece they want to learn. They already do. they want to play it correctly in order not to betray their love of the piece, and have to help them to be reliable in situations of emotional stress in front of an audience. So many factors come in mind when you teach a student. Not only a text from a past, which is present in its reality of today, has to be handled, as well as it has to be reset in its own meaning. And that meaning can be even differing from that of the composer. Ravel used to say, one don't interpret me, one plays me, as is considering that the slightest freedom with the text would be a betrayal. Probably because of situations where performers have taken too much freedom to recompose the piece. So where is the borderline between interpretation and improvisation, recomposition, and who defines the good taste in how you manage a transition through a rubato for atmospheric change of a tonality or a mode into a thematic material, or just for the sake of it. At some point, you just do it because you respond with your inner ear to your eyes, having seen the notes, and translate them through your fingers, who betray you if you can control them more than less in the way you would like it to be. So you have the opportunity to replay until you reach the moment where you might play one section well, but then you have to put them all together in the flow of the storytelling. And it's not the sum of the details that makes the whole, it's the whole that exists, because you start with a piece which, unless you improvise it, therefore is not yet written. But if you play a written piece in the narrative delivery, you have to appear to discover where it leads you, where it modulates, where it surprises you, which degree it goes to. You can analyze the emotional impact of a harmonic progression, or if not analyze, perhaps the right word would be describe the sensual experience which the composer suggests through this change of harmony, or how the melodic line has a leap or a repeated note instead of not, and therefore see if alternatively it would satisfy you, even if of course you don't have the choice, but just to test how it would be gone if it has gone in another direction, if the eighth notes were first before the half notes and opposite. So thinking outside of the box is to serve better what is inside the box. But since it's subjective, we don't have the opportunity but to compare factual things when people play a same piece, how clean it is or how well it's memorized. And these are factual things, but they don't define the spiritual sum which uplifts our spirit when we hear it, or takes our psyche to such an elevated moment of humanity, of spirituality. And we are aroused by the music, which triggers in us our instincts as well as our reflection. And that is so beautiful in so-called classical, romantic, of course, Baroque, Renaissance, modern, contemporary, just not necessarily entertaining music, though it does have its aspects also. Except that a fugue doesn't trigger as much, though it could, arousal as much as a rhythmic ostinato of a dance, which is meant to bring that element of titillation to the soul, because music is to reflect, is to project the poetic being of ourselves. Our day life is punctuated by daydreams, and hopes, and a poem, a painting, a film extends an aspect of our inner creativity which not all of us are able to harness or to put in some kind of a form that exists other than in our inner world. And this inner world is so rich that we can have contradictions, we can have passions, and we can have moments of absolute non-energy, where we receive, impress before we express our own energy. And if we use the vehicle of a piece or a composition of another composer to find what in fact makes us feel like we are in a certain level of identification with it, then it becomes our piece. So beyond all aspects of describing how we go about playing a piece of music, from learning to mastering to the meaning of it, I think it's important to keep in mind that generations have attempted it before us with their convictions, which we might find perhaps today's fashionable interpretation laughable, but perhaps we would be laughable to the next ones. And ultimately, it doesn't really matter. What matters is to be in harmony, in unison with one's own convictions of music making, and becoming, during the instant of the performance, the vibrating membrane of the composer's written out markings on the score, which come alive through you. And if they don't come alive through you, so what's the purpose other than to just look at the beauty of the score analytically by itself? That is beautiful. It's like beautiful emotion that triggers a blueprint of a structure which hasn't been built, or has been built, but you look at the blueprint and imagine how it could have been built differently. But there it exists. And it exists only because of how it means to us. And of course, therefore, many of my colleagues would disagree with the way I would go for a sforzando in Beethoven. Is if SFP, how do you play at the same time forte and piano in the same note, since it doesn't decay fast enough to be piano before the next beat if it's a fast tempo? Did Beethoven not know that, or did he suggest to hint, rather, in my opinion, to a string instrument bow that can obtain this effect? Or is it just a way to pull us above the factual through this kind of notation, and tell us to find out, figure out how we can mean it? Is it SFP? Is it SFNP? And when is the piano triggering? Does it go under the resonance of the forte, or do we have to delay in order to have it heard? So this is the composer's choice. We can also, of course, doctor it and try to smart ass it and say, okay, I think I'm going to save it by delaying it so I can be more clearly heard. And this is objectively valuable. But then we come down to the point of, do we play what the composer wrote, or do we write our own if we don't like the way it is, as my teacher used to tell me? And therefore, this humility and this responsibility at the same time to transmit this expectation of doing the right thing for the student, and giving the tools to the student to make these choices, and respect the student's intuition, and add the layers of reflection from experience or from one's own understanding. I think it's an honest exchange in front of a score which keeps all generations facing it at the level of the imagination.